"I have the answer," said the maid's son. The millionaire laughed, but soon lost his words. In the heart of New York, the elite gathered for a billion-dollar contract protected by unbreakable codes. The best experts failed in front of everyone, until a 13-year-old boy, invisible in that room, stood up with courage. What he revealed next not only opened the vault, but exposed a treason capable of toppling empires. The marble clock at Solstice Tower's reception counter read exactly 7 p.m. when the limousines began lining up outside the main entrance. Each car carried not just businessmen and women, but living symbols of power: bankers, investors, renowned lawyers, and heirs to ancient fortunes. The 61-story building rose illuminated against the Manhattan night sky like a monument to wealth. Up high, on the glass roof, awaited the most talked-about meeting among the financial elite, an international contract that could change the course of entire companies and move over $1 billion. The press had been kept away, but rumors swirled in the corridors of Wall Street. This was the night Reginald Hawthorne, the tycoon many called the last titan of New York, would seal a historic deal. In the conference room, the ambience was carefully designed to impress. The glass walls offered a panoramic view of the city, where the lights of Times Square seemed like tiny stars twinkling in the distance. In the center, an oval mahogany table exuded sophistication, surrounded by black leather chairs occupied by impeccably dressed men and women. Waiters circulated discreetly, serving French wine and imported water, while security guards in dark suits watched every corner with watchful eyes. At the head of the table, Reginald Hawthorne maintained his impeccable posture, a dark gray tailored suit, a burgundy tie, and a gaze that blended coldness and ambition. He didn't need to raise his voice to be noticed. His mere presence made the air heavy. Everyone knew this wasn't just another negotiation, but a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make history. And it was in this setting of luxury, power, and contained tension that something unusual crept into the subtext. Discreetly present alongside the multi-million-dollar apparatus was someone no one noticed. Selena Duarte, the cleaning lady who, hours earlier, had been instructed to remain on the floor only to finish the finishing touches. Sitting in a corner, wearing her blue uniform and gloves discreetly tucked into her pocket, was her 13-year-old son, Diego Duarte, waiting for his mother to finish her shift. Invisible to everyone, they watched the parade of powerful figures, unaware that in a few moments the fate of that meeting would be completely altered. What no one knew was that the true impact of that evening would not come from the million-dollar signatures on the table, but from an unexpected voice that would change everything. Once all the guests were seated, a digital panel lit up in the center of the oval table. It wasn't just an ordinary paper contract, but a document protected by technology never before seen in meetings of this level. Chief Counsel, Dr. Percival Monroe, explained in a firm voice that to open the digital vault where the final contract was stored, it would be necessary to decipher a sequence of symbols in a nearly forgotten language, ancient Aramaic. The protocol had been imposed by the foreign partners as a way to test the intelligence and trustworthiness of those involved. The idea was simple in theory, but it carried a clear message. Only the truly prepared would have access to the promised billion. The atmosphere, previously elegant and solemn, took on a new weight, one of defiance and distrust. The first to approach were the interpreters, hired at a premium price. Men with respected CVs, doctors of ancient languages, translators who had previously served governments and renowned universities. They adjusted their glasses, carefully analyzed the symbols projected on the panel, and began muttering hypotheses. But each attempt resulted in failure. The words didn't fit. The system wouldn't accept their translations. The safe remained locked, emitting dry sounds of rejection with each incorrect command. Some executives exchanged uneasy glances, others drummed their fingers on the table. Reginald Hawthorne, however, remained impassive, though his eyes betrayed growing impatience. With each lost minute, the aura of trust in the room diminished. It was in this atmosphere of frustration that the silence became deafening. The official translator, Harold Whitmore, wiped the sweat from his brow and confessed he wasn't sure what the symbols meant. A murmur of disapproval ran through the room. The foreigners present, like German banker Astrid Falkenhayn and Arab investor Karim al-Rashid, watched coldly, as if doubting American competence. The clock ticked. The safe wouldn't budge. And, in the corner of the room, Diego Duarte observed every detail, without anyone paying attention to the boy. His eyes shone, recognizing features and signs that seemed indecipherable to the doctors. What no one knew was that, among all those men in suits and ties, only a teenager in a simple uniform held the real key. The first attempts failed one after another. The official translator, Harold Whitmore, had already spent nearly 15 minutes in front of the panel, but his proposed combinations were rejected by the system with a sharp error sound that echoed throughout the room. His face flushed, and the confidence he had carried upon arrival began to crumble under the dozens of critical gazes. The chief counsel, Dr. Percival Monroe, tried to remain calm, but his voice no longer held the same firmness as before. "Perhaps it's a distinct dialect," he ventured, but the very tremor in his hands betrayed his uncertainty. Tension hung like an invisible cloud over everyone, and each second seemed to weigh a ton. Reginald Hawthorne, seated in his leather chair, observed coolly. His sharp gaze moved from expert to expert, as if measuring each one's worth with the same ruler he used to calculate falling stocks. He drummed his fingers on the mahogany desk, in no hurry to intervene, but his every gesture increased the pressure in the room. The contract wasn't just a business deal. It was a power struggle between international tycoons. Any sign of weakness at that moment could turn American pride into a laughingstock in Zurich, Tokyo, or Dubai. The failure to decipher ancient symbols wasn't just a technical problem. It was a public embarrassment that tarnished the image of everyone present. A heavy silence fell over the room as Harold, defeated, stepped back from the panel and admitted, "I don't know what it means." Shock rippled through the table. Some executives masked their indignation by taking hurried sips of wine. Others shifted in their seats, exchanging discreet glances. The foreigners, like Astrid Falkenhayn and Karim al-Rashid, crossed their arms in silence, but their haughty looks said it all: contempt. The once imposing and majestic atmosphere now seemed fragile. And while the biggest names in law and linguistics succumbed to their inability, a pair of young eyes, in the corner of the room, began to see what no one else could. While executives adjusted ties and lawyers whispered, trying to save face, a discreet figure remained almost invisible in that luxurious setting. Selena Duarte, in her simple blue uniform and worn shoes, discreetly collected glasses and organized papers that no one else bothered to notice. To those present, she was just another employee tasked with maintaining the impeccable environment, a peripheral detail amidst the billions of dollars at stake. Beside her, sitting in a corner chair, sat Diego Duarte, her 13-year-old son. He wore a faded sweatshirt, old jeans, and sneakers with worn soles, a stark contrast to the tailored suits and sparkling jewelry of the elite. To everyone present, mother and son were nothing more than shadows. Diego, however, didn't seem bored like a typical teenager. His eyes never left the digital safes panel. With each symbol that flashed on the screen, his heart raced. He remembered an old notebook left by his grandfather, filled with scribbles and languages that seemed indecipherable to anyone, but had become a secret pastime for him during silent nights in his small apartment in Queens. Now, faced with similar symbols, something inside him screamed that he knew those shapes. He began to whisper softly, as if speaking to himself. "I've seen this before. I know what it says." Selena noticed her son's fixed gaze and immediately tugged at his arm, nervous. "Diego, don't say anything. This isn't the place for you." Her tone was low, almost pleading. She knew any interruption could cost her her job, or worse, draw the cruel contempt of those powerful men. But Diego didn't take his eyes off the panel. The silence of the experts and the growing humiliation in the air gave him courage. And in that moment, one detail made all the difference. Reginald Hawthorne, already impatient, heard the boy's words. The tycoon raised his eyebrows, slowly turned his head toward the corner of the room, and, with a cold, mocking smile, made it clear he had noticed the presence of someone who should never speak. The executive's chatter died down when Reginald Hawthorne's mocking laugh cut through the air like a blade. Everyone turned to the corner of the room, where Diego, huddled beside his mother, seemed to have said something forbidden. The silence that followed was more oppressive than any words. Selena, her face pale with nervousness, tried to justify herself, saying her son was just tired, that she didn't want to disturb them. But it was too late. The attention of the wealthiest men in the room was fixed on a plainly dressed teenager, whose boldness seemed almost absurd in such a setting. Reginald's eyes narrowed, and his ironic smile was followed by a sentence that echoed like a blow. "Repeat what you said, boy." Diego swallowed hard, but didn't look away from the digital panel. His voice was low but firm, filled with the conviction that only the truth can give. "I know what it says." A collective laugh erupted among some executives, as if it were the most unlikely joke of the night. Men accustomed to dealing with billions laughed at the audacity of a 13-year-old boy. One of the lawyers shook his head, muttering something about insolence. Selena, desperate, squeezed her son's arm, trying to make him back off. But Diego didn't blink, didn't waver. There was a certainty in his eyes that belied his age. Reginald, still smiling, leaned back in his leather chair and folded his hands. His voice, thick with sarcasm, filled the room. "So let's see. The best interpreters in New York have failed. Doctors with decades of experience haven't succeeded, but the maid's son swears he knows." "Very well, boy. Show us the impossible." The silence that followed was almost suffocating. Every glance in the room oscillated between contempt and curiosity. Selena closed her eyes for a moment, overcome by the fear that this would end in humiliation. But inside Diego, something greater than fear grew. The unique chance to prove that, even invisible to the eyes of the elite, he held the answer no one had dared imagine. A deep chuckle echoed through the room, shattering the silence like thunder. Reginald Hawthorne, still leaning back in his leather chair, leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany table, and gave a look of contempt. "Are you listening to this?" he said loudly, almost theatrically. "A kid in torn sneakers thinks he can solve what my highest-paid men have failed to decipher." The comment drew laughter from some executives, who slapped each other on the back, amused by the childish audacity. The sarcasm spread through the room like poison, reinforcing the brutal hierarchy between those who commanded billions and those who barely had enough to survive. Selena felt her heart sink. Each word Reginald spoke was a blade against her son's dignity. She tried to intervene, saying Diego was simply tired and shouldn't be taken seriously, but her voice was drowned out by the collective laughter. One of the foreign lawyers commented ironically that perhaps it would be better to call a children's dictionary instead of renowned professors. Diego's face flushed, not with embarrassment, but with determination. His fists clenched silently, and his eyes remained fixed on the symbols projected on the panel, as if the mockery of the powerful couldn't extinguish the flame burning within him. It was then that Reginald stood up. His presence dominated the space like that of a general before soldiers. He walked to the digital panel and, pointing to the symbols, issued the challenge in a firm, arrogant voice. "Very well, boy. If you think you know, prove it. Show us all. Show the world that a maid's son can surpass the greatest minds in this city." The laughter ceased. The room, previously filled with derision, plunged into a dense, almost suffocating anticipation. Eyes turned to Diego, who took a deep breath. In that moment, the boy could no longer retreat, and when his voice echoed again, it would have the power to silence even Reginald Hawthorne's empire. Diego's heart was beating like a drum, but his steady steps belied his age and humble origins. He rose from the chair he'd been hiding in the corner of the room and began walking toward the digital panel. Each movement seemed slow, dragged down by the weight of the eyes now upon him. Selena tried to hold his arm, nearly in tears, but the boy gently released her, without saying a word. It was as if an invisible force was propelling him forward. The sound of his worn sneakers on the marble floor contrasted with the absolute silence that dominated the room. The experts, once full of arrogance, looked at him in disbelief, some frowning, others with expressions of pure irritation. Harold Whitmore, the official translator, couldn't bear what he saw and exclaimed indignantly, "This is crazy. This kid is unprepared. He's going to ruin everything." But his voice sounded weak in the face of the scene. Diego, determined, approached the panel and ran his hand over the symbols, as if reuniting with old friends. His look wasn't one of doubt, but of recognition. The boy didn't hesitate, and this made many uncomfortable. No one expected confidence, only insecurity. Reginald Hawthorne, standing, watched every gesture with a mixture of mockery and suspicion. To him, it was just another spectacle to humiliate mother and son in front of the elite. But what no one noticed was the detail. Diego's eyes shone as if carrying an impossible-to-ignore certainty. When he finally lifted his chin and opened his mouth to deliver his first translation, the silence in the room became almost sacred. Everyone expected a mistake, a slip-up, a joke. What they would hear next, however, would be the beginning of something that would forever change the course of that night. Diego took a deep breath, placed his fingertips on the luminous panel, and fixed his gaze on the enigmatic symbols glowing blue. For a moment, the entire room seemed suspended in time. Not even the waiters dared move. Then, in a clear, firm voice, he pronounced the first word in ancient Aramaic, articulating each syllable as if he'd been trained for it his entire life. A soft beep echoed from the digital safe, and suddenly, one of the locks glowed green, releasing the first layer of security. The sound was like thunder in the silence, drawing expressions of sheer astonishment from the audience. Some executives rose from their chairs, stunned, while others exchanged looks of disbelief. Harold Whitmore dropped his briefcase, unable to believe what he was seeing. "Impossible," he murmured in English, his voice trembling. Selena, clutching her chest, felt her heart race. Between fear and pride, she could barely breathe. And in the background, Reginald Hawthorne remained motionless, though his eyes couldn't hide the shock. The billionaire who had been laughing at the boy moments before now had a frozen expression, as if he had just witnessed the improbable. Diego, for his part, didn't smile, didn't celebrate. He simply kept his focus on the panel, as if this were just the beginning. He recognized other symbols and knew he could move forward. The entire room fell into a reverent silence, a different silence, heavy, charged with expectation. The boy who had been invisible minutes before now became the absolute center of attention, and every word that would come out of his mouth would have the power to build or destroy empires. He looked up at Reginald, and for a brief moment, he no longer seemed like a servant son. He seemed like the guardian of a secret everyone there feared would be discovered. As Diego progressed with the translation, the lines of symbols became more complex, almost as if they weren't just technical codes, but hidden messages waiting for someone capable of understanding them. He pronounced each word calmly, and the panel responded obediently, releasing new locks in sequence. But halfway through the fourth line, something caught his eye. Repeated symbols in odd positions, forming a sort of parallel notation. It wasn't just the writing of the ancient language. There were additional instructions hidden there, something that shouldn't be in plain sight. Diego frowned and muttered to himself, "This isn't part of the safe. This was placed here on purpose." The anxious executives interpreted the boy's pause as insecurity. One of them even laughed nervously, commenting that the boy's miracle had already gone too far. But Diego was undaunted. His eyes scanned the symbols quickly, and the more he deciphered, the clearer the enigma became. Within the billion-dollar contract were secret clauses, embedded almost imperceptibly, that completely changed the terms of the agreement. If unnoticed, the document would hand over a large portion of Hawthorne International's control to two executives formerly allied with Reginald. Discreetly hidden names appeared in the codes: Maximilian Cross and Edmund Blackwell. The boy swallowed hard, aware of the gravity of what he had discovered. This wasn't just about deciphering a safe. He was revealing a conspiracy at the heart of the most important negotiation of the decade. Selena noticed her son's worried look and squeezed his hands, as if sensing danger. Around the table, the foreign tycoons watched intently, but they didn't grasp the scale of what was happening. Diego looked up and stared at Reginald Hawthorne, hesitant to reveal what he knew. But the silence in his voice was short-lived, for what he was about to say would have enough power to shatter entire reputations. Maximilian Cross's name appeared clearly in Diego's translation, and then Edmund Blackwell's appeared among the hidden clauses. The impact was immediate. For a second, the hall fell silent, as if the air itself had disappeared. Then Reginald Hawthorne's eyes widened, and fury filled his face. The vein in his temple throbbed, betraying the rage that grew by the moment. He clenched his fists so tightly that the sound of his gold rings grinding against his skin echoed through the hall. This was not just an uncomfortable discovery. It was a betrayal at his own table, on his own turf. Reginald stood up abruptly, his chair sliding back violently. The crash of his impact against the marble floor echoed like thunder. "You dare betray me?" His voice, filled with hatred, reverberated through the room, making some executives shrink back in their chairs. Maximilian Cross tried to compose himself, keeping his expression cool, while Edmund Blackwell discreetly wiped the sweat from his forehead. Both knew they had been inescapably exposed, but they still sought a way to discredit the boy. "That boy doesn't know what he's talking about," Edmund shouted, trying to turn the revelation into a joke. But no one laughed. The look on Reginald's face was proof that the mask had slipped. Meanwhile, Diego stood silently before the panel, feeling the weight of having uncovered a billion-dollar fraud. Selena, behind him, trembled with fear for the consequences this could bring to her son. The room was divided between shock and anticipation of his next move. Reginald walked slowly toward the two accused men, his eyes flashing with anger and wounded pride. But before any definitive words, he turned to Diego. The silence that preceded his next gesture was so dense it seemed to take everyone's breath away. And in that moment, a single question hung in the air. What would the tycoon do with the boy who had exposed the greatest betrayal of his life? Reginald Hawthorne's fury still echoed through the room when eyes turned to the foreign guests. Astrid Falkenhayn, a German banker with a ruthless expression, leaned back in her leather chair and crossed her arms, analyzing every detail like a predator before its prey. Her blue eyes glittered, not with surprise, but with cold calculation. For her, this was more than an internal betrayal. It was confirmation that the much-vaunted American elite was not invincible. Beside her, Arab investor Karim al-Rashid drummed his fingers on the table, suppressing a discreet smile. Among themselves, the foreigners exchanged looks filled with judgment, and perhaps even delight, as they witnessed an empire crumble before a mere boy. Some American executives, uncomfortable, murmured among themselves, trying to stifle their embarrassment. The image of absolute power, so carefully cultivated by Reginald and his team, was shattering like shattered glass. Those men and women accustomed to seeing impeccable contracts and ironclad strategies were now faced with an almost surreal scene. A 13-year-old boy, dressed simply and with trembling hands, was exposing flaws that renowned experts had overlooked. It was more than embarrassing, it was humiliating. The foreigner's confidence in the negotiation was becoming shaky. The prestige that had sustained the evening now hung on a fragile thread, held not by the lawyers or the translators, but by Diego. Reginald himself sensed this. He looked up and saw in Astrid and Karim's expressions something he deeply hated, the masked contempt of those who see weakness. Wounded pride was an open wound for men of his stature, and allowing outsiders to witness such humiliation was like bleeding among sharks. The billionaire gritted his teeth, fighting the urge to explode once more. But the damage was already done. The international elite had witnessed his vulnerability. The only one who seemed unfazed was Diego, still standing at the panel, about to reveal more symbols. And with each new sound of the safe unlocking, everyone knew that the chasm between Reginald's pride and the emerging truth would only widen. The metallic sound of the safe releasing another lock echoed through the room like a verdict. It was at that moment that Maximilian Cross suddenly stood up, his chair scraping across the marble floor with a sharp screech that made everyone flinch. His face, normally cold and calculating, was now red with fury and fear. "Enough!" he shouted, pointing a finger at Diego. "This boy doesn't know what he's doing. He's playing with symbols he doesn't even understand. If you keep listening, you'll ruin everything." The attempt to transform indignation into authority sounded desperate. Edmund Blackwell, pale, joined the chorus, saying it was insane to entrust the fate of billions of dollars to a teenager. But the digital panel seemed to mock her words. With each symbol Diego correctly translated, a new sequence revealed itself, proving there had been no error. The room, previously confused, now leaned toward the boy. Even the foreigners, incredulous, leaned forward in their chairs, fascinated by the precision with which Diego deciphered each line. The contrast was stark. Two veteran executives, men of prestige, trying to discredit a boy, while the system itself confirmed his competence in real time. Selena, her heart pounding, wanted to scream for her son to stop, but she couldn't. It was as if an invisible hand was holding her back. Reginald Hawthorne, for his part, remained motionless. He intervened, neither to support Diego nor to protect him. His eyes flashed, watching intently, as if calculating every reaction. But deep down, it was clear. Part of him wanted to believe the boy was wrong, that all the humiliation would be reversed in minutes. Maximilian, realizing he was losing control, took a step toward Diego, his voice thick with menace. "Stop right now, before you regret it, brat." The entire room held its breath, and it was at that moment that the panel glowed brightly, signaling that only one last line remained to fully unlock the safe. The entire room was suspended in anticipation as Diego brought his fingers closer to the digital panel. The blue glow reflected in his determined eyes, transforming him, for an instant, into something larger than a 13-year-old boy. He took a deep breath and firmly pronounced the final sequence of words in ancient Aramaic. The panel vibrated, emitted a low sound, and then exploded in a bright green light. The digital safe recognized the translation and granted full access. The click of the locks echoed like thunder, and the mahogany desk shook as the hidden compartment slowly opened, exposing its contents. Everyone leaned forward, eager to see the long-awaited billion-dollar contract. But along with the main document, additional papers were slid out, hidden in a parallel compartment. It was a secondary contract, written in subtle codes and treacherous clauses, which handed over a large portion of the Hawthorne Empire to Maximilian Cross and Edmund Blackwell. The forged signatures, the Machiavellian details, everything was there, exposed before the eyes of the international elite. The room plunged into collective shock. The impossible had just happened. A humble boy, the son of an invisible maid, had defused a billion-dollar fraud in front of the world's greatest tycoons. Maximilian paled, and Edmund stumbled over his words, desperately trying to justify the additional document as a worthless draft. But no one believed him. The heavy silence was broken only by the sharp sound of Reginald's hand slamming down on the table, the impact reverberating like a gunshot. His gaze, filled with hatred and humiliation, alternated between his two trusted men and the boy who had exposed them. Selena, trembling, hugged Diego from behind, feeling that from that moment on, their lives would never be the same. And, given that turn of events, everyone knew the meeting would not be remembered for the signed contract, but for the betrayal revealed. And the worst was yet to come. The safe remained open, displaying side by side the official contract and the accompanying document of the fraud. The room, plunged into silence, awaited Reginald Hawthorne's reaction. But the billionaire, accustomed to dominating any room, seemed to have lost his voice. His eyes, once cold and calculating, now reflected incredulity. He tried to speak, but his throat dried up. No sound came. For the first time in decades, the man who had transformed empires with a single sentence couldn't articulate a single word. The weight of humiliation was greater than the glitter of any fortune. Maximilian Cross and Edmund Blackwell, terrified, tried to regain control of the narrative, mumbling feeble explanations, but no one paid them any attention. All eyes were fixed on Reginald. It was like watching a king fall. The tycoon ran a hand across his forehead, wiping away the cold sweat, but the gesture only heightened the perception of his vulnerability. A few foreign executives exchanged discreet smiles, pleased to see the Titan of New York collapse in the face of his own mistakes. The contrast was stark. On one side, the man who controlled billions reduced to silence. On the other, a humble boy who had become the most powerful voice in the room. Diego remained motionless, showing no sign of arrogance, simply observing the tycoon in silence. Selena, tears in her eyes, clutched her son's shoulder, unable to believe that this moment was real. It was as if time had stopped, forever freezing the image of Reginald, the financial giant, defeated not by a millionaire rival, but by the son of the woman he had never noticed. The air was heavy, but there was still a sense that this was not the end. Because, even silent, Reginald was still a dangerous man, and everyone knew that his next reaction could redefine not only the negotiation, but also the fate of whoever dared challenge him. While everyone remained paralyzed by Reginald Hawthorne's silence, a previously invisible figure began to emerge. Selena Duarte, who until then had limited herself to collecting glasses and remaining in the shadows, stepped forward. Her teary eyes reflected not only fear, but also an undisguised pride. With firm hands, she placed one on Diego's shoulder, as if sealing a silent pact with her son. There were no speeches, no grand gestures, just the dignified presence of a mother who, before the world's elite, demonstrated that her greatest treasure was right there, in front of everyone. The boy no one had dared to take seriously. The eyes that had previously passed over Selena, as if she were part of the furniture, were now fixed on her. A few foreign executives watched her silently, surprised by her erect posture, her serene expression. There was something inexplicably powerful in seeing her lift her chin, bearing the weight of all that attention. For many there, she was no longer the maid in the blue uniform, but the woman who had raised the boy capable of exposing a billion-dollar conspiracy. Diego, feeling his mother's touch, took a deep breath and remained calm. It was as if the courage that kept him standing firm before the panel was not just his, but inherited from her, passed down from generation to generation. The tension in the air was beginning to transform into something new: respect. There was no applause or open declarations, but in the silence of the gazes, it was clear that Selena and Diego were no longer invisible. And while Reginald remained speechless, defeated by the emerging truth, Mother and son stood united, undefeated in the face of the contempt that had previously surrounded them. However, this newfound dignity was only the prelude to something even greater, because what had happened there would not be confined to the walls of Solstice Tower. Very soon, the whole world would hear about the son of the maid who silenced a billionaire. The next morning, headlines spread like wildfire. The maid's son who saved $1 billion blared across newspapers in New York, London, Berlin, and Dubai. The story spread across television, news sites, and social media, accompanied by blurry images from the night before, snapshots discreetly taken on the cell phones of executives who couldn't resist capturing the improbable. The whole world was talking about the feat of a 13-year-old boy who, in silence and humility, had defeated the arrogance of billionaires. Suddenly, Diego Duarte wasn't just an anonymous name from Queens. He was the protagonist of a story that seemed straight out of a movie, but that everyone knew was real. While journalists crowded the door of the small building where Selena lived with her son, business experts discussed on television shows how Hawthorne International's security breach could change the market balance. For some, it was a lesson in arrogance. For others, a reminder that power isn't measured solely in numbers, but also in knowledge. Selena's dignity began to be cited as an example in opinion columns, while professors pointed to Diego as a symbol of the intelligence hidden in the most invisible layers of society. The boy who once went unnoticed in the corridors of life now inspired millions. At Solstice Tower, Reginald Hawthorne remained secluded, away from the cameras, trying to contain the devastating impact on his image and business. His empire would survive, but it would never be seen the same way. Maximilian Cross and Edmund Blackwell could no longer walk in public without bearing the stigma of betrayal. And amidst all this, Diego and Selena continued their lives with simplicity, but now with the certainty that the whole world was watching. That boy had opened not only a safe, but also the doors of truth, revealing that even a maid's son could silence the powerful and turn destiny upside down. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel now, activate the bell, and like this video so you don't miss the moving stories that impact and transform lives. Thank you so much for your support.